All right. Greetings and welcome back once again. This is Emuna Yisrael. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Um, y'all see me trying to do other things, But people keep asking me questions. Like I said, I think my excitement about the discussion is discovery. Like I said, I like research. Again, for the Lev project, this is awesome research. So if you see me keep talking about it, this is me in research mode and also me being asked questions. And I don't purport to know all the answers. So when I do my discovery with the material, then I come back and share and hopefully you can do your own discovery as well. So are you ever going to get it? Proto ADOS, a honest look. So as I was reading over the book by PhD Ray Winbush on the conversation of, hold on, what's the name of the book again? Hold on. Should America Pay is the name of the book. And so as I'm reading it, there are some things that were mentioned. So I was like, oh, okay, stop. You know what I'm saying? Highlighter. Let me go look that up. So this is what I have for you today, what I have looked up and I just found so interesting. All right. As always, the links are in the box. This is the homework. Just so that we can have an informed discussion. You know what I mean? So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm hopefully not going to take too long on this. So much other stuff going on in the world today, y'all. And plus, I got to do some work for the yummy. You know what I mean? I got to do some work. I got to do some graphic design. I have to switch modes. So I have to switch out of research mode and actually do some graphic designing for my company. So this is why I'm going to try to make this nice and quick. Okay, on the screen, we have no pensions for ex-slaves. This is out of archives.gov. This is another excellent resource. Let me make this thing bigger. As you know, me and the light. After looking at computer screen for so many years with, doing graphic designing and logos and stuff like that messes with my eyes. So I can't even really like look at the computer as long as I used to. But this is from archives.gov. No pensions for ex-slaves. How federal agencies suppress movement to aid freed people. So knowing who's speaking, this is going to be a little blast from the past, but I think it's very important as there's a saying, we stand on the shoulders of those who come before us. And there's so much that's happened before we got to this point. And there's a saying that there's nothing new under the sun. And given that there's nothing new under the sun, it behooves us to look at what has happened, see why it failed or why it succeeded, and look at all of the different variables. I've said that before, and I will continue to say it. Again, informed conversations. How federal agencies suppress movement to aid free people. This particular one was written in 2010, but it's recapping what actually happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So let me see if I can make this bigger. Onward to Victory, Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association. And I was looking into Miss Calloway House, or Callie House, and it drew me in. Her story drew me in. I went to the elder Miss Mary Bell, Mary, her name, it was Berry, I believe her name is, who did a lot of research and unearthed a lot of this information concerning her story, which is awesome. And I.H. Dickerson. Okay. So we're gonna go into this. This is who they are, and this is one of the proto organizations, or the predecessors of what we're looking at as this thought of ADOS today. Okay. The union, I'm not going to read everything because it's a little bit lengthy, but I'm going to read, so we could get some context. The Union victory in the Civil War helped pave the way for the 13th Amendment to formally abolish the practice of slavery in the United States. But following their emancipation, most former slaves had no financial resources, property, residence, or education, the keys to their economic independence. So this is some of the stuff that we're hearing today. This is some of the stuff they realized then. Efforts to help them achieve some semblance of economic freedom, such as with the quote 40 acres and a mule, end quote, was stymied. Without federal land compensation or any compensation, many ex-slaves were forced into sharecropping, tenancy farming, convict leasing, or some form of menial labor arrangements aimed at keeping them economically subservient and tied to the land owned by former slaveholders. The poverty which afflicted them for a generation after emancipation held them down to the lowest order of society, nominally free but economically enslaved, wrote Carter G. Woodson in The Miseducation of the Negro in the 1930s. In the late 19th century, the idea of pursuing pensions for ex-slaves, similar to pensions for Union veterans, took hold. If disabled elderly veterans were compensated for their years of service during the Civil War, why shouldn't former slaves who had served the country in the process of nation building by compensating for their years of forced unpaid labor? So by 1899, listen to this, about 21% of the quote Black population nationally had been born into slavery. So these are the people who were actually enslaved. This is who's going to be bringing this claim. Okay, they were born younger. Like the woman Miss House, she would have been like 4 because she was born in 61, and 65 is the emancipation. So she was 4, so she was physically born in slavery. So in 1899, about 21% of the so-called Black population nationally had been born into slavery, according to historian Mary Frances Berry. That's her. She wrote the book, and I'm gonna put that book is on my list. Had the government distributed pensions to former slaves and their caretakers near the turn of the century, there would have been a relatively modest number of people to compensate. Because remember, at the end of at this time, there had been people who had been freed. For some time, they had, like they're saying, the percentage of the population was around 21%. The North would have been freed, and you would have been talking about those who were in the South. So there was a whole dynamic, even in 1899, that it wouldn't have just been everybody, right? That's understandable. But the movement to grant pension to ex-slaves faced strong opposition, and the strongest came from Southerners in Congress, and the strongest came not from Southerners in Congress, but from 3 executive branch agencies. It was opposition impossible to overcome. Land allocation signed by Johnson administration. Thank you for those who just joined us. We are reading over a little blast from the past. This Proto ADOS. Getting a little information, very, very important information, very timely information, and just to see what has happened in times past. In the late stages of the Civil War and its aftermath, the federal government, primarily Republicans, tried to relieve destitution among freed people and help them gain economic independence through attempts to allocate land. These efforts, so it was the Republicans who offered the 40 acres and a mule, right? These efforts, both military and legislative, help explain why African Americans thought that compensation was attainable. Special Field Orders Number 15, issued by General William T. Sherman in January of 1865, promised 40 acres of abandoned and confiscated land in South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida, largely the Sea Islands and coastal lands, that had previously belonged to Confederates to freed people. So this is if you want to look it up, Special Field Order Number 15, issued by General William T. Sherman in January of 1865. So this is where the 40 acres and a mule was promised. Sherman also decided to loan mules to former slaves who settled the land. But these efforts were rolled back by President Andrew Johnson Amnesty Proclamation of May 29, 1865. So less than 5 months later, he was like, nah, you know what I'm saying? No backsies. He's taking it back. By the later part of 1865, thousands of free people were abruptly evicted from land that had been distributed to them through Special Field Orders Number 15, Circular Number 15, issued by the Freedmen's Bureau on September 12, 1865. Coupled with Johnson's presidential pardons provided for restoration of land to former owners, with the exception of a small number who had legal land titles, free people were removed from the land as a result of President Johnson's restoration program. So it was given, and as we read, in a short time, it was snatched back, right? The Freedmen's Bureau, I said I wasn't going to read the whole thing, and here I am reading it, right? But I'm going to continue. The Freedmen's Bureau Act had been established by Congress in 1865 to help former slaves transition from slavery to freedom. Remember, I was trying to remember the name, and one of the subscribers reminded me of the Freedmen's Bureau. And so they were responsible for a number of things. They tried to go into banking. They tried to connect families who had been sold. People were, they had these registries where people were trying to go and find a family that they lost, things of this nature. All right, so they was over the distribution of the land. Section 4 of the Act authorized the Bureau to rent no more than 40 acres of confiscated or abandoned land to free people and loyal white refugees for a term of 3 years. So it was just for a short period of time. At the end of the term or at any point during the term, the male occupants renting the land had the option to purchase it and then receive a title to the land. So it's kind of like rent to own, but they didn't have to rent it. This was compensation to a certain degree. I read in another place there were like 40,000 people who got access to the land. I can't remember if it was here or somewhere else. But Johnson's restoration policy rendered Section 4 null and void and seriously thwarted the Bureau's efforts to help the newly emancipated require land. I'm going to jump down a little bit. So we had some issues here, right? They gave it, they took it back. Let me jump down. And it's going on to say that they didn't have any tools, they didn't have any rations. You have the land, but now what you need, you have to have the ability to work it. You know what I'm saying? You have to have the resource. This is going to show, let me show you this. This is the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association of the United States. This is a certificate of what I'm calling Proto ADOS, which was one of the many organizations that were working towards reparations that we're going to read about in a little bit. They were also doing a kind of community endeavor in which, as you look down here, it says aid the sick and bury the dead. So they had chapters all throughout the United States where they were going to pool their resources, and being that they didn't have compensation for labor that was lost through slavery, but they were petitioning for like 26 years to get such compensation. And these were people who were actually enslaved, right? They weren't getting it, but in the interim, they weren't just sitting saying, oh, we don't have it. They were actually raising funds within and of themselves to aid the sick and bury the dead because they didn't have life insurance and they didn't have health insurance, right? And so they were actually burying their own dead, and you'll see this on the certificate. They talk about confiscating the land. You can read it at your own discretion. This was what I'll read a little bit of what it was supposed to be. Section 4 of the proposed bill explicitly called for the land to be distributed to former slaves. It says, out of the lands thus seized and confiscated, the slaves who have been liberated by the operations of the war and amendment of the Constitution or otherwise who resided in said Confederate states on the 4th day of March, 1861 or since, shall have distributed to them. So this was who qualified for these particular reparations, right? They're saying what the date, what you fall under, all of these things, right? So these people would have actually been alive. Shall have distributed to them as follows, namely, to each male who is head of a family, 40 acres, to each adult male, whether the head of the family or not, 40 acres, to each widow who is the head of a family, 40 acres, to be held by them in fee simple, but to be inalienable for the next 10 years after they become seized thereof. At the end of 10 years, the absolute title to said homestead shall be conveyed to said owners or to the heirs of such as they are then dead. So this was what the agreement was. You had to, be on the land, till the land, do what you needed to do. And then after 10 years, we read something else that said after 3 years, you had the right to buy. And this particular one is saying after 10 years. And then we know they took it back, okay? So let me jump down here to pension movement begins at the century ends, okay? By the last decade of the 19th century, the idea of trying to procure the enactment of pension legislation for ex-slaves for their years of unpaid labor was put into action. The end of the 19th century, that would be later part of 1890s, there and about, right? The concept of ex-slave pensions were modeled after the Civil War era program of military service pensions. And the first ex-slave pension bill, H.R. 1119, was introduced by Representative William Connell of Nebraska in 1890. And you can look up that bill. I looked it up, right? It was introduced at the request of Walter R. Vaughn of Omaha, a white Democrat and ex-mayor of Council Bluffs, Iowa. He did not believe that it or subsequent bills should be identified as pension bill, but instead as a Southern tax relief bill. Vaughan recognized that pensions would financially benefit former slaves and would indeed be a semblance of justice for their years of forced labor. But the outcome he looked for involved ex-slaves spending their pensions in the South. And I've heard other people say this, like give it to them because they're going to put it back in the economy and it's going to boost the economy. So this dude, what, 1890, 100 plus years ago, said the same thing. Okay, but the outcome he looked for involved ex-slaves spending their pensions in the South in order to give the devastated Southern economy a financial boost. The push for ex-slave pension gained momentum in the 1890s and continued in the early 20th century. This grassroots movement was composed largely of former slaves. So this is the actual people, right? Their family members and friends. It emerged during the nadir of American race relations through roughly 1877 into the early 20th century. So let me jump down here. Okay, there were a number of, it says the pension movements, this is what they were calling it then, right? Flourished in spite of or even because of these obstacles. Speaking about, you know, what happened that came out of the Ku Klux Klan, I read that in another article. You know, things that were happening to say, you know what, I'm not going to let you possess these lands. Okay. But this is what I found interesting, the number of different organizations very similar to today. There were a number of ex-slave pension organizations within the movement. The National Ex-Slave Pension Club Association of the United States, that's Vaughan's Justice Party, the Ex-Slaves Petitioners Assembly, the Great National Ex-Slave Union, Congressional Legislative and Pension Association of the USA, the Ex-Slave Pension Association, the Ex-Slave Department Industrial Association of America, and others. So how many did they name just then? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the sixth one. But there is a paucity of documentation for groups other than the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association of the United States, MRBNPA. The ex-slave pension organizations did not work together. Listen to this. The ex-slave pension organizations did not work together collectively. But there is evidence that officers of at least a few of these organizations were interested in joining forces and consolidating their groups. So here we are. This is something that we can either learn from, share, whatever the case may be. That if you look into the landscape today of this discussion, wherever it's happening, there is a number of different organizations, as it was over 100 years ago, marching towards the same goal, but all in different spaces, some working together, some willing to work together, others not willing. And it says here that they were looking or interested in consolidating their groups. I'm going to continue. It says this particular group was chartered in August 7, 1897, and had a dual mission to petition Congress for the passage of legislation that would grant compensation to ex-slaves, particularly elder slaves, and to provide mutual aid and burial expenses. So they were lobbying the Congress, and they wanted basically, you know, burial insurance and health insurance to a certain degree. I'm going to jump down because they became the front runner because of their organization and the way in which they campaigned throughout the states. According to what I read in one place, they got over 300,000 members. And then I heard another estimate at 600,000. That's a big disparity between 300 and 600. But nonetheless, when you look at what they were trying to accomplish, what they didn't accomplish, and what they did accomplish, I think is something that is absolutely noteworthy. It says the association collected membership fees in order to help defray lobbying costs, printing, publication expense, and travel expenses for the national offices. Monthly dues were reserved for mutual aid purposes to aid the sick, the disabled, and for burial expenses. Ex-slaves, like the physical, actual, literal ex-slaves, and their allies gave their meager resources to help further the movement because they believed in the organization's mission. Let me jump down a little bit. Again, I put the link in the box. Now, here's what they were asking for. They were asking for the organization supported a proposed pension payment scale based on the age of the beneficiaries that appeared in every ex-slave bill from 1899 onwards. Ex-slaves 70 years and older at the time of disbursement were to receive an initial payment of $500 and a $15 a month for the rest of their life. Those aged at 60 to 69 will receive $300 and a $12 a month for the rest of their life. Those aged at 50 to 59 years old will receive $100 and $8 a month. And those under 50 will receive a 4-month pension. If formerly enslaved persons were either very old or too ill to care for themselves, their caretakers were to be compensated. Like, these are from the mouths of those who, I keep saying that because it's just interesting. This is why I like to read enslaved narratives, because sometimes we like to I guess, revision history, you know what I mean? And it's interesting to hear from their own mouths, those who were in this situation, who came out of this situation, what they were asking for and what were their needs at that time. What are some of the same things that are present today, and what are some of the things that are not? Let me jump down here. And this here is Miss Callie House. She was a widow, a mother, and former slave, became a national leader of ex-slave pension movement. That's her right there. Okay, something to look into. Now, this I want to jump down. Association faces strong opposition to pensions for U.S. government, which would have been their form of reparations, okay? Or for unpaid wages. This is what they were going for. 3 federal agencies, the Bureau of Pensions, the Post Office Department, and the Department of Justice, worked collectively in the late 1890s and into the early 20th century to investigate individuals and groups in the movement. When I first read that, it reminded me of Garvey. As I continued to research, it's interesting that Miss Mary Barry spoke about those who were left off from this movement actually were who made up the Garvey movement, which is wow. That I didn't know that. That was pretty cool. The officials who pursued the investigations throughout the idea of pensioning ex-slaves was unrealistic. Listen to this. The officials who pursued the investigations thought the idea of pensioning ex-slaves were unrealistic because the government had no intention of compensating former slaves for their years of involuntary labor. Harrison Barrett, the acting assistant attorney general for the Post Office Department, admitted in an 1899 circular that, quote, there has never been the remotest prospect that the bill would become law or a law, end quote. And they're talking about that HR, what was it, 11119? They were like, we have no intentions of doing that. So when you jump down, they started to come together to see how they can come against this particular organization because of the traction that this organization was making. And so, to my understanding, they sent in people to try to find out what laws potentially they were breaking so that they can, thwart the efforts of the organization. Okay. In February 7th, 1902, letter to the commander-in-chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Commissioner of Pensions, blamed the ex-slave pension organization for arousing false hopes for, quote, reparation for historical wrongdoings to be followed by an inevitable disappointment and probably distrust of the dominant race and of the government, end quote. And so when, this is wild, man. When the members of and the leaders of this particular pension organization started to petition and get traction, the narrative was turned to see like it's all your fault. I don't even know why you're telling them to come over here because we ain't giving you spit. Basically, is what they was saying, right? Arousing false hopes. I'll continue. So what they tried to do is get them on fraud. This is the very same thing they got Marcus Garvey on, where they trumped up some fraud mail charges. This is, and it's they used, actually she predates Marcus, and they get her on it to a certain degree, and then they come back again and do the same thing to Marcus, who, to my understanding, picked up a lot of the supporters who were already looking to be compensated and saw that that didn't work. And so now I'm understanding that they were already primed to a certain degree to hear another alternative. Okay, them giving us not going to work. Well, what about back to Africa? You know what I'm saying? So now it's all, coming into play. But let me see here. The Bureau of Pensions also sent circulars to agents affiliated with various ex-slave pension organizations, although these circulars usually carried the disclaimer, quote, while any class of citizen has an unquestioned right to associate for the purpose of attempting to secure legislation believed to be advantageous, these words were often simply a formality. The Bureau's inspector did not find evidence to incriminate any of the influential MRB and PA officers whom they suspect of fraud. The Post Office Department took action when it presumed that the U.S. mails were being used to defraud ex-slaves. The Post Office used its extensive anti-fraud powers against the movement, issuing fraud orders to organizations and offices. So essentially, they were stopping the mails, they were intercepting the mails, they was claiming that the mails were fraudulent. And remember, they were doing two things. They were lobbying and they were looking to take care of and bury those who were dead amongst them as well as sick. So they were doing a community type of thing. So again, they intercept the mail. Let me jump down here. You can definitely come and read it. Again, like I said, this is what I found so very interesting. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave it in the box. I'll jump down here. You can go ahead and read all the things that happened. In 1901, they were trying to trump up charges on her. The other leader or head, Dickerson, I believe he had passed away or passed. They tried to get him first, right? He dies in 1909. So let me read this part. In 1901, Dickerson was found guilty of swindling, quote unquote, in a city of court in Atlanta, Georgia. The press reported that he would have to pay $1,000 fine or be sentenced to 1 year on the chain gang. The conviction was overturned later that year by the Georgia State Supreme Court, which reasoned that in order to be convicted of swindling, Dickerson would have had to have claimed that an ex-slave pension bill had passed and became law, or that an appropriation had been made to pay pensions, and not simply that he was advocating for the passage of pension legislation. So they were using, basically, they said House was a proponent of using the Constitution. So she was going on the premise that your Constitution allows for this stuff. So they were using, things that many would say are only allowed to be used for Europeans, like lobbying and things of that nature. So they were trying to hem them up on those grounds. So they wasn't able to hem him up on swindling. But then in 1902, a special examiner of the Bureau of Pensions conducted an inquiry into Dickerson and drafted an affidavit on the investigation, but found nothing incriminating. When Dickerson died in 1909, House soon became the leader in the forefront of not only the MRB and PA, but of the movement. So when her counterpart passes in 1909, this melanated female becomes the face of this proto-reparations movement, this pension movement. Let me see. And she was looking, they began to work with lawyers. They tried to file a class action lawsuit in federal court to the tune of $68 million, dealing with cotton tax and trying to associate that with the involuntary servitude. So that's in Johnson versus McAdoo cotton tax lawsuit. So that's something to check out as well and see what went down with that. So it was the Post Office, the Pension Department, and another one that were working together. Let me jump down here. The Post Office Department was unrelenting as it continued to search for means to limit House's influence and curtail the movement. After a prolonged investigation, House was arrested and indicted on charges of mail fraud. She was accused of sending misleading circulars through the mail, guaranteeing pensions to association members, and profiting from the movement, which the research shows that is not the truth. She denied ever assuring members that the government would grant pensions or that a law had been passed providing pensions for ex-slaves. There was also no evidence that she profited from the movement. The Post Office identified activities as mail fraud without definitive evidence, and their decision to deny use of mails were nearly impossible to appeal. And then lastly, it says after a 3-day trial in September of 1917, that would be 102 years ago, an all-white male juror convicted her of mail fraud charges, and she was sentenced to a year in jail in the Missouri State Prison in Jefferson City. She was released from prison in August of 1918, having served the majority of her sentence with the last month commuted. So that is very, 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 very interesting. I put the link to the box so that you can go over this yourself. If you didn't know, let me know. If you didn't know, let me know. This also is a link. I'm not going to go over the fullness of it, but this is a link to the correspondence and case files of the Bureau of Pensions pertaining to ex-slave pension movement 1892 to 1922. So in this particular, this is 20 years of files from the Bureau of Pensions. So they were watching them, and the same thing they have for Marcus Garvey. His file is declassified. So you can go in and look into some of the things that were being looked into and some of the angles in which these particular movements were taken down, essentially. So this is came off a microfilm, and then it was typed up. It's in the National Archives in DC. If you jump down here, it gives you an overview of the pension movement of ex-slaves. It gives you a little bit of what was just in the article. Let me jump down. It talks about a lot of what was in the article. And then when you go down here, it tells you what they were asking for at that time. And then I found something interesting here. They have the records of the descriptions. They have the case file. The following case files have been identified. Because at one point, to my understanding, they were trying to, basically old school audit them. And so they handed over their files to see that, listen, we're legit. This is what we're doing. And since they weren't able to find anything, they, decided to trump something up. So these are some of the things that are in the files. If you're in DC and you can have access to this type of stuff, this is the kind of stuff that research is made of. Let me see. And it goes to tell you the rest of the related files that are on microfilm. There's a lot of this old school stuff that are on microfilm, and you have to actually go there to see what it looks like. So there you go. That is my findings on the Proto ADOS movement over 100 years ago. Let me release my screen here. And what kind of happened. Hey, Chris Harris, what's going on? Hey, Jason, what's going on? Good evening. I saw one tough guy. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the discussion. Hopefully you were able to get something from that. If you did know, pass it along. This is why, for me, I think it's important to look at what came before instead of saying we're going to reinvent the wheel. What came before, what worked, what didn't work, why didn't it work, what were some of the tactics that were used to bring it down. Like I said, according to my research, there's a video I'm going to put in the box for you guys to watch. But the elder who did the study on this, she went in. She went in. I ain't going to front. She went in. But like she said that from this particular movement that had over 300,000 people signed up, and she says something about reparations that I think might hurt a lot of people's feelings. I think I wanted to come back and talk about what she said directly. Maybe we could have a discussion about that. But she says there is extensive records. I wouldn't say extensive, but there are records of those 300,000 people who at that time was with this ex-slave mutual relief bounty and pension association, who were talking about put me on the books, that they were ex-slaves and that they were the children of ex-slaves and that they wanted a part of these reparations. And so she was speaking to the possibility of finding the ancestors of these people, the descendants of these people, the descendants of these people who were on this roster throughout the country over 100 years ago, and that being a starting point from saying, yes, they are on record from saying that they want access to X, Y, and Z. You know what I'm saying? So I thought that was an interesting approach for somebody who has been doing a lot of research in this particular area. So again, like I said, that's what I have for you today. This is the Proto ADOS. Um, how federal agencies suppress movements to aid free people. And this is history. And again, like I said, they went over and did the same thing to the Marcus Garvey UNIA discussion. So every time someone saw something that came before them, they tried to tweak it a little bit and say, okay, they did this and they, so let's tweak it a little bit. Another outstanding thing was the matter of so many different movements not being able to agree amongst oneself about the direction. So every time you fraction the people, you lose power. You know what I'm saying? So imagine how many other people, if this movement had 300,000 and they have, five that they named and a whole lot of other unnamed movements, how much power was lost in the push because of being fractioned. So when you go back to the first video when I asked about how many other movements are out there and whether or not people are working together, historically, it's because that has been the approach that hasn't necessarily, we saw it in the civil rights. You have SNCC and you have Southern Christian Leadership Conference and you have, you have these people and you have that people and everybody's saying this is the way, this is the way, this is the way, that's the way, this is the way. And this is just what it's been. So I'm not going to stay long today. If any questions or comments, feel free to ask. Like I said, the links are in the box. People keep asking me questions. Hold on, I got a question. I'm just going to throw it out there. I didn't do the research as yet, but there's this conversation between what the Caribbean is looking for and whether or not, I'll read it right now shortly, whether or not they will be entitled to what America is getting. And this is an interesting take on the way in which it's being approached. And I've heard many people speak about the fact that the way it's being approached now is divisive, and that this has been going on before, and that wasn't necessarily a concern. Because if you have criteria for getting the reparations, then how can someone from the Caribbean or from the mainland continent come and take it? You know what I'm saying? That was something that was brought up. If you have criteria that you can't just show up and be like, hey, you owe me, or you can't just show up and be a $5 Indian. You kind of have to be able to prove it. John Conyers, I'm going over the book, Should America Pay, by Raymond A. Winbush, PhD. And John Conyers has a chapter in this book. John Conyers is the congressman who proposed this bill back in I think, 89, and it's been on the books for 20 something years, but has not been pushed through. Okay, so he's the one who, this proposal to study reparations, he's the one who proposed it, okay, in this chapter. But I'm going to read the conclusion in this chapter because I found it interesting. It's short. Let me drink some water first. He says, from the perspective of where do we go from here with the reparations movement, the importance of grassroots organizing towards the development of a critical mass cannot be overstated. All of the elements necessary for ultimate success of reparations for Africans and the descendants of Africa, the litigation process, the legislation efforts, and the community education process, are pieces of the movement that shall be fueled by a critical mass of organizers, activists, proponents who exemplify the force and fire of the Reverend Nat Turner, General Harriet Tubman, the singular Sojourner Truth, the courageous John Brown, the fearless Ida B. Wells, the genius of W.E.B. Du Bois, the self-determined Booker T. Washington, the organizer Marcus Garvey, and by any means necessary Malcolm X, the majestic, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, the institution building of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, the cooperative economics of Madame C.J. Walker, the quiet, regal strength of the incomparable mother of the civil rights movement, Miss Rosa Louise Parks, and the indomitable statesman of Frederick Douglass, who reminded us the power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will, and the limits of tyrants are determined by the tolerance of those who they oppress. All of these people flow and contribute to historian Vincent Hardin's There is a River. At the end of the day, we will look upon all of the struggles of Africans in America leading up to this final effort of achieving redress for the crimes committed against them and their ancestors. It will be a movement that will unite Africans in America with Africans from around the globe and show humanity that crimes against Africans in the form of enslavement and colonialism is an issue of justice that must be made right. I found that latter portion of what he just shared very interesting, given that one of the new grassroots movements are currently being under great scrutiny for being divisive and not trying to unite those melanated people who are on mainland American continent with others throughout the diaspora. But the person who pushed forward this bill, and he tells you why he did it and for what reasons he did it in this chapter, is saying that the ultimate goal is not to necessarily disparage one another. I just read from the no pensions for ex-slaves, and I didn't see Caribbean people or mainland continent people being the reason that that particular movement didn't flourish. You see what I'm saying? So it's like as things go along and things don't work, sometimes people try to find who's to fault and who's to blame. But in this particular situation, over 100 years ago, it clearly says that it was the government who said, I didn't intend to give you anything. Like, how honest are we being with the history? There's many things that come after that, but like I've been saying from the time that I was asked about my thoughts on ADOS, is all I'm saying is let's be honest with the history that we have available to us. And if at all best, you know what I mean, if you're going to say that you're standing on whatever side you're standing on, stand on truth. Because if you don't stand on truth, then everything else is going to crumble thereafter. So with that said, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Like I said, all the links are in the box. As I learn more, I share more, and we continue to have this discussion. I was invited to a roundtable. I'm considering it. You know, again, I'm a baby in this discussion. I'm really looking at the slavery because of my interest in healing, right? So I'm really looking at this history from a reparatory standpoint, but not necessarily in a monetary standpoint, not necessarily the bag first, but looking at the damage that has been done spiritually, emotionally, and physically, looking at the ailments that are associated with a certain people group based on the foods that they had access to, based on the cultures that grew up around certain things like high blood pressure and diabetes, and things that a lot of people say melanated people are more susceptible to, or at a higher risk for. And these things are directly connected to the experience here in the diaspora, right? So this is the things, how we treat our children, how we grow our children, our mind state. You know, some people's learned helplessness, feeling as though no matter what you do, nothing can really be accomplished. The generational curses of melanated people throughout the diaspora, like that's really what I look into and I'm very interested in. But I know that this part of it, this thought of monetary compensation, is also something that is at the forefront of a lot of people's mind. And I think I said it before, and I'll say it again, that the Caribbean that's being blamed, I have to speak right now, I said it before and I have to look it up again, are seeking to get their own designation. And I do know on both sides, and I've heard this before, on both sides of this discussion online, there's some high level ratchetness that's happening. Like, is this what has been in the hearts and minds of the people? Hey, King, look who joined us. Welcome to the conversation. Is this what has been in the hearts and the minds of the people? And now there's an opportunity to say this type of stuff to one another? Because if that be the case, then no bill that passes is going to deal with the toxicity that's within us. Some of the things that I'm hearing being said and spouted on both sides of the discussion is troubling. You know what I mean? If you saw your brother, your sister in person, you know, would you say those things? Would you do those things? Legislation can't fix a black heart. You know what I'm saying? Legislation can't fix toxicity. That's the work that we have to do as people internally. But just come. You just come. That means you missed it. You're gonna have to click the links in the box, or you're gonna have to go back. Thank you for joining us. And this is what it's about: facilitating the discussion so you can lower this barrier. It's easy to hate somebody that you don't know. It's easy to stereotype somebody and say, I hate that person based on this stereotype, as opposed to based on the actions and behavior of this individual. And if people can get us to emotionally suit up and take sides, then they can use us as tools against one another. So we have to kind of really understand what are the objectives of things that we're buying into, and why ultimately it can be problematic. When I'm reading about this particular movement that happened 100 years ago, it was basically those who were affected directly saying, "Hey, man, you owe me." But I find the government's response, I'm like, wow, they was really like, at that time there was no PC, there was no politically correctness, so they was just real out with it. Like, hey, I'm charging you by rousing up the Negroes, essentially. I'm charging you with you by gassing them up. You know I ain't gonna do that, which I found so telling. That was ridiculous. But anywho, at any rate, I'm gonna go ahead and do. I got some graphic designing to do, y'all. So I'm gonna have to switch gears right now. I'll come back and talk a little bit. There was something else I wanted to talk about. I'm gonna have to do it later. We'll see what happening tomorrow. I pray everybody have a blessed night. Talk again soon.